No one in the marble lobby of Ashcroft Global paid attention to the man in the faded work jacket waiting for a janitorial interview. Nolan Reed was met with a thin smile from the receptionist, watched a hiring manager deliberately let his papers slip to the floor, and caught the sideways smirks of other applicants pretending not to notice. But when his application reached the 48th floor, Billionaire Chief Executive Vivienne Ashcroft read his last name, and her hand froze over the page. She rose from her chair, her voice dropping to something almost cold. "Bring him to me," she said. "Right now. If you love stories about dignity, hidden truth, and the reversal that people deserve, press subscribe and stay with this channel." Nolan Reed arrived at the Ashcroft Global headquarters on a gray, rain-soaked morning, a thin folder of papers tucked inside a plastic sleeve to keep them dry. He had walked past this building before, years earlier, though back then the lobby had none of the polished marble or the towering screens that now looped footage of a young, composed chief executive named Vivienne Ashcroft. He did not linger on her image. He was there for one reason: a janitorial position on the night shift, the kind of job that let him be home during the day when his daughter needed him most. At the front desk, a recruiter named Paige Calloway studied his worn jacket, his re-soled shoes, and the decade-long gap in his employment history with open suspicion. When she learned he had once worked as an engineer and was now applying to mop floors, she laughed loudly enough for the other applicants to hear, asking if an engineer nobody would hire had finally settled for cleaning them instead. Nolan had rehearsed this moment in his mind on the bus ride over, telling himself that whatever happened in this lobby did not matter nearly as much as what waited for him at home, a 9-year-old daughter named Harper who believed her father simply worked nights fixing things that broke. He had built an entire second life around protecting her from a truth that would only frighten her, that the man who once helped design the backbone of a billion-dollar company now had to compete for a job scrubbing its floors. He thought of her packed lunch sitting on the kitchen counter and reminded himself that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford to indulge in front of strangers. Nolan did not answer the insult directly. He simply explained that he had maintenance experience, understood electrical systems, and was available for night hours. Paige pressed further, asking if he was certain he could handle something as simple as this job, then let his folder slip out of her hands and onto the floor, watching him without offering to help. Nolan knelt and gathered the pages one by one, calm and unhurried, his eyes catching a ventilation grate near the reception desk that was vibrating in a way it should not have been. He mentioned, without any edge in his voice, that the exhaust motor sounded overloaded and ought to be inspected before it failed completely. Paige assumed he was performing for sympathy and told him to wait in the last row of chairs while his file was processed into the internal hiring system. The name Nolan Everett Reed appeared moments later in the pending approval queue on the 48th floor, an ordinary entry in an ordinary list. Or so it seemed to everyone except the assistant, who noticed a red flag attach itself automatically beside it. The label beneath his name read, "Restricted File, Founder-Level Clearance Required." Vivienne had inherited the company only 8 months earlier, stepping into a chair still warm from her father's absence, and she had spent nearly every one of those months feeling as though she were reading a script someone else had written long before she arrived. She trusted her instincts more than she trusted the polished reassurances of the people around her, a habit that had already saved her from 2 disastrous deals that season. Yet nothing in her training had prepared her for the strange, cold recognition that came from seeing a stranger's name and feeling as though the ground beneath her father's legacy had quietly shifted. Vivienne Ashcroft was in the middle of a board meeting about a merger worth billions of dollars, one that could determine the company's future for a generation. Evelyn Harrington, the executive vice president and the most powerful voice on the board, kept pressing her to sign the approval that same day, insisting that market conditions could shift at any moment. Vivian sensed something wrong beneath the urgency, but had no evidence yet to justify delay. In the middle of the meeting, her assistant slid across a printed alert from the hiring system, and the instant Vivian saw the name Nolan Everett Reed, she remembered a locked box her father had left behind before he died. Inside that box had been only three things: a sealed letter, an old technical access badge bearing the name Nolan Reed, and a handwritten note that read, "If this man ever comes back, do not let Harrington know before you do." Vivian had wanted to investigate for years, but every record connected to the name Nolan Reed had been quietly wiped from the company's archives. She forced herself to stay composed and asked her assistant which position he was applying for. When the answer came back, night shift custodian, she thought for a moment she had misheard it entirely. Across the table, Evelyn Harrington noticed the smallest shift in the chief executive's expression and asked if something was wrong. Vivian turned the page face down and claimed it was only a minor staffing matter, nothing worth the board's time. After Evelyn left the room, Vivian read the name 3 more times, unable to understand why a man her father had placed under the tightest secrecy in the company would now be standing downstairs, applying to scrub floors. Vivian had always regarded Evelyn as one of the steadiest figures in the company, a woman who had guided 3 prior transitions of leadership without a single public misstep, and it unsettled her deeply to feel even a flicker of suspicion towards someone she had trusted since childhood. Yet the note in her father's handwriting kept returning to her thoughts, a warning too specific and too deliberate to dismiss as simple caution. She called Paige Calloway directly and told her, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, that Nolan Reed was not to leave the building under any circumstances. Paige assumed the chief executive wanted to personally deal with a problem applicant and quickly sent security toward the waiting area. Vivian stared out through the glass at the city below, then spoke quietly into the phone one more time. "Bring him to me," she said. "Not to human resources. Bring him straight here." The instant the call ended, Evelyn Harrington stepped back into the room and asked a single question, her voice suddenly very still. "Is Nolan Reed in this building right now?" Down in the lobby, 2 security officers approached Nolan without explanation. Paige announced loudly that his file had been flagged from the highest level of the company, and within seconds the applicants around him assumed he must have committed some crime or falsified his paperwork. She demanded he hand over his visitor badge and leave the premises immediately. Nolan did not argue. He only asked whether this counted as the company's official answer to his interview, his tone even and unbothered by the small crowd now watching him. At that moment, Vivian's assistant arrived and announced that the chief executive wanted to see him immediately, and the atmosphere in the lobby shifted at once. Paige froze mid-sentence. The applicants who had been laughing at Nolan minutes earlier now looked at him with something closer to caution. Paige tried to recover, suggesting that perhaps the chief executive simply wanted to question him personally and warned him not to exaggerate his qualifications in front of her. As the elevator climbed, Nolan watched the floor numbers rise without any visible surprise on his face. The assistant asked if he had ever been to the executive floor before, and Nolan answered simply that this floor had not existed when he used to work there. That single remark told the assistant, more clearly than any file could, that this was not an ordinary applicant. Nolan studied the reflection of the executive floor in the elevator's polished doors, noting the new layout, the relocated server access points, and the subtle redesign of the security checkpoints, cataloging each change the way a man might catalog the rooms of a house he had once lived in and been forced to leave behind. He did not allow himself to feel anger toward the building itself, only toward the choices certain people inside it had made in his absence. Somewhere beneath the calm exterior, A small, disciplined part of him was already running through old protocols, wondering whether the systems he had once trusted his life's work to were still being maintained with the same care he had once given them. Inside the boardroom, Evelyn Harrington was already trying to convince Vivian to let the legal department handle Nolan, describing him as a disgruntled former employee with a history of causing damage to the company. Vivian asked why an employee dismissed more than a decade earlier would still be enough to worry her now, and Evelyn quickly shifted her tone, insisting she was only protecting the company's interests. When the elevator doors opened, Nolan stepped out in his worn jacket, standing in stark contrast to the polished glass and steel of the executive floor. He and Vivian looked at each other for the first time, and she noticed immediately that he showed no anger and no desperation, only a kind of tired steadiness that seemed to have been earned the hard way. Evelyn approached first, her voice cold as she told him she thought he understood by now that he was no longer welcome inside this building. Nolan answered without raising his voice. "I did not come here for you," he said. "I came here for a job." Vivian set her father's sealed letter on the table between them and asked the question that had been building in her chest since she first read his name. "Why did my father write that this company still owes you something?" Nolan recognized his handwriting immediately but did not ask her to open it. He said the debt between himself and the company's founder had been settled long ago, and that all he wanted now was a legal job with steady hours and health coverage. Vivian asked why an engineer who had once worked for the company would apply to be a janitor, and Nolan told her plainly that the market did not care how skilled a person once was if his file carried the label of an industrial disaster. Evelyn cut in and reminded everyone of the old report, insisting Nolan had violated procedure and cost the company millions of dollars. Nolan did not argue the point. He simply asked whether she still had the original version of that report. Evelyn said the file had been destroyed under standard retention policy, and Nolan looked directly at her. "Then you are accusing me based on a document that no longer exists," he said. Vivian began to notice how many of Evelyn's answers seemed to contradict each other. She offered Nolan a sum of money to quietly resolve the situation, but he refused, unwilling to let his silence be purchased a second time. He asked instead to be evaluated the same way any other applicant would be. Vivian decided to bring him on for a 30-day probationary period under the supervision of Della Monroe, the manager who oversaw the custodial staff. Evelyn objected strongly, warning that a man with a history of sabotage should never be given access to the building again. Vivian replied that custodial staff only reached restricted areas under supervision, and that every hallway was covered by cameras regardless of who walked through it. Nolan agreed to the terms but asked for one condition of his own, that his file receive no special treatment of any kind. Before he left the room, he glanced at a monitor displaying the building's power systems and mentioned, almost in passing, that the backup load readings looked incorrect. Evelyn mocked him openly, saying he had not even picked up a mop yet and already believed himself an engineer again. Nolan answered evenly that a system does not care whether the person who catches its failure is wearing a suit or a uniform. Vivian asked one more question before letting him leave the room, wanting to know why he had never, once in 12 years, tried to clear his name through the courts or the press. Nolan told her that a man fighting a company with unlimited lawyers rarely wins, and that the only thing he had ever truly wanted to protect was his daughter's ability to grow up without watching her father lose that fight in public. Evelyn used the silence that followed to remind the room that sentiment was not evidence, and that the board had more pressing matters than an old grudge dressed up as tragedy. Vivian ignored her, escorting Nolan to the elevator herself, an act that visibly unsettled every assistant who witnessed a chief executive walking a probationary janitor to the door with something close to respect. That same night, A section of the server floor lost power at the exact location Nolan had pointed to only hours earlier. Each night before his shift began, Nolan called home to check on Harper, keeping his voice light and unbothered no matter what had happened hours earlier in a boardroom 48 floors above him. During one such call, she asked if he liked his new job, and he told her simply that he was helping people see things they had missed, a description close enough to the truth to satisfy her curiosity without frightening her. Those short conversations became the quiet anchor of his days, a reminder that whatever indignities waited for him inside that building, none of them were large enough to touch the life he had built outside of it. Nolan began his new position under Della Monroe's supervision, and she knew nothing of what had happened upstairs. All she saw was a careful worker who never complained and always finished the hardest tasks first. Some of the office staff began leaving coffee cups, wrappers, and spilled food behind him on purpose, right after he had cleaned a section, simply to watch how he would react. Word of the incident on the executive floor had already spread downward, and a few employees began calling him the engineer with a mop under their breath whenever he passed. Nolan never responded to any of it. He noted which areas needed extra attention and continued his work without complaint. Della had managed the custodial staff for nearly 2 decades and had long ago learned to recognize which employees were simply passing through and which ones treated the work with genuine care, and Nolan belonged unmistakably to the second category from his very first shift. She noticed how he checked equipment no one had asked him to check, how he memorized the layout of the building faster than anyone she had trained before, and how he never once complained about the small cruelties some of the office staff seemed to enjoy inflicting on him. Della had heard the rumor about the executive floor summons but assumed it was simply gossip born from boredom, the kind of story that circulated whenever someone slightly unusual joined the team. She kept her questions to herself, choosing instead to judge him by the only measure she trusted, the quality and honesty of his work night after night. While cleaning the technical floor, Nolan discovered new sensor units installed under a vendor code that belonged to a supplier the company had previously banned from its contracts. He also noticed that the backup power schematic had been quietly altered so that several critical floors now depended on a single shared switching station, a mistake far too obvious to be accidental. Nolan reported it to the maintenance supervisor, but was brushed aside because he was still only a probationary employee. Della privately advised him not to make waves, though she also kept a copy of his notes without telling him. That same night, Vivian reviewed the security footage and watched Nolan methodically check vents, control panels, and wiring with the practiced eye of someone who had clearly done this work before, long before he ever wore this uniform. She finally opened her father's sealed letter. Inside, Graham Ashcroft confessed that Nolan had not caused the disaster 12 years earlier at all. He had been the one who discovered a design flaw and personally saved the entire data center by building an emergency transfer route with his own hands. Graham also wrote that Evelyn Harrington had convinced him to place the blame on Nolan instead, fearing a lawsuit large enough to bankrupt the company. Graham admitted, in his own handwriting, that he had been a coward. Near the end of the letter was a line that made Vivian's hands go cold. Evelyn is not only hiding the past, he had written. She is still using the exact same method. At the same moment, in the switching room downstairs, Nolan found a tamper seal that had been deliberately cut open. Someone had altered the system again, right after he had warned them about it the first time. He checked the maintenance schedule and realized that whatever failure was being engineered next had been timed to occur on the exact day the board planned to finalize the merger vote. Nolan faced a difficult choice. If he stayed silent, he could likely keep his job and avoid being dragged back into a past he had spent years trying to leave behind. If he spoke up, Evelyn could use the old file to destroy him all over again before anyone believed a word he said. He chose to tell Della first, rather than acting alone, trusting her judgment over his own instinct to disappear quietly. Della believed him because every technical prediction he had made so far had turned out to be accurate, and she quietly allowed him to photograph the equipment within the boundaries of his custodial duties. Nolan discovered that several maintenance contracts had been awarded to a company with financial ties to the Harrington family, cheap components billed at inflated prices meant to look routine on paper. More importantly, the faulty components were causing small, repeated power failures that were quietly dragging down Ashcroft Global's stock price right before the merger vote. Nolan spent several cross-referencing maintenance invoices against the actual serial numbers stamped on the equipment itself, discovering that at least a third of the parts billed as new replacements were refurbished units sold at prices meant for premium components. He organized his findings the same methodical way he once organized emergency response plans, labeling every discrepancy with dates, locations, and the names of the technicians who had signed off on installations that never should have passed inspection. It was slow, careful work performed after midnight, with a mop bucket parked beside him as cover, and none of it would have mattered without someone at the top willing to listen. Evelyn intended to use that manufactured instability to pressure Vivienne into selling the company to a fund controlled by her own family. Vivienne secretly brought in an independent auditor named Elias Wren to examine the suspicious contracts, without alerting the board. Evelyn learned that an investigation was underway and ordered Paige Calloway to dig through Nolan's employment file, hoping to find a reason to remove him before he could present anything formal. Evelyn had spent the better part of her career learning exactly how much damage a well-timed accusation could do to someone with no institutional power to defend himself, and she saw no reason this situation should be any different from the dozens of quiet removals she had orchestrated over the years. She reminded Paige that perception moved faster than truth inside any large company, and that, by the time anyone bothered to check the facts, the narrative would already be settled in the minds of everyone who mattered. Paige, eager to prove her loyalty and secure her own position, did not hesitate to follow the instructions handed down to her. Paige fabricated a claim that Nolan had accessed a restricted area without authorization. In front of several employees, she confiscated his badge and announced that he had used his custodial position to infiltrate confidential company data. Nolan was made to stand beside the security desk while coworkers walked past, looking at him the way people look at someone accused of a crime. Evelyn appeared and told him that men like him always found a way to blame someone wealthier rather than accept their own failures. Nolan remained calm and simply asked how she had arrived on the scene so quickly, before any formal report had even reached the executive floor. For a brief moment, her composure slipped. Della arrived with the shift assignment log, proving that Nolan had every right to be in that area to address a reported water leak. Vivienne overturned the termination decision and ordered an internal hearing to review the entire matter. Evelyn stood before the board and declared, without hesitation, that Nolan was not a witness at all, but the very man who had sabotaged the system in the first place. The boardroom was filled with directors, attorneys, and bank representatives when the hearing began. Nolan was seated at the far end of the table, still in his custodial uniform, since his shift had ended only minutes before the meeting started. Evelyn used the contrast deliberately, presenting the old report from 12 years earlier and describing Nolan as an undisciplined engineer with a history of unauthorized interference in company systems. She asked the board directly whether they would trust a woman who had served the company for decades, or a man who now mopped floors to survive. A few members of the board actually laughed at the comparison. Nolan made no attempt to win them over with emotion. He asked to see the original report, and within seconds, pointed out that the date on the document did not match the formatting the company used at that time. He also noticed that the digital signature had clearly been added years after the fact, a detail easy to overlook unless someone understood exactly what they were looking at. Evelyn accused him of speculating without proof. Vivienne presented her father's letter, but Evelyn dismissed it as a private note with no legal standing whatsoever. At that moment, Auditor Elias Wren stepped forward and presented the suspicious maintenance contracts he had uncovered. Elias walked the board through each transaction with the patience of a man who understood that numbers, presented clearly enough, could dismantle a lie faster than any argument. He displayed invoice after invoice, each one bearing minor inconsistencies easy to miss individually, but impossible to ignore once laid side by side, showing a pattern repeated across nearly 3 years of maintenance spending. Several directors who had approved these budgets without close scrutiny shifted visibly in their seats, realizing they too had unknowingly signed off on funds that ultimately enriched a single family at the expense of the wider shareholder base. The money trail led directly to a shell company registered under the name of Evelyn's own niece. Evelyn changed direction entirely, accusing Nolan of conspiring with Vivienne to invent the entire scandal simply to block the merger. Nolan asked to display the technical diagrams on the main screen and explained, in plain terms anyone in the room could follow, exactly how the system had been manipulated to create small failures large enough to lower the stock price, but small enough to avoid regulatory attention. Evelyn sneered that he still believed he was the smartest person in the room, even though he had walked in carrying a mop. A junior board member, uncertain until that point which side of the room to trust, quietly asked Nolan how he could be so certain about details from 12 years earlier without notes or files of his own to reference. Nolan explained that a man does not forget the exact moment he built something with his own hands to keep hundreds of strangers from losing their jobs, that some memories do not fade simply because the world moves on without acknowledging them. That answer landed harder than any legal argument Elias Wren had presented, because it reminded everyone in the room that behind every spreadsheet and every contract sat real people whose lives had been quietly rearranged by decisions made far above their heads. Evelyn tried once more to steer the conversation back toward procedure, insisting that memory was not admissible in place of documentation. Nolan answered quietly that he was simply the only person in the room willing to look at the place where she had hidden the evidence. Della walked in carrying a box of files discovered behind a false wall in an old supply closet. Inside the box were the original engineering blueprints, an incident log, and a signed agreement bearing Graham Ashcroft's own signature. The documents proved that Nolan had saved the data center and protected the company from bankruptcy years earlier, exactly as his letter had claimed. More significantly, Graham had once promised Nolan a portion of preferred company shares in exchange for the emergency system he designed under pressure. That agreement carried a name of its own, the Reed Covenant. The shares were never enough to give Nolan control of the company, but they granted him veto power over any deal involving the sale of its core infrastructure. Evelyn had hidden the document for years because the current merger could never proceed if Nolan's rights were ever formally recognized. The board slowly turned its attention toward her, and she tried to defend herself, claiming Nolan had already accepted a settlement and waived every future claim against the company. Nolan revealed that the payment he received back then had not been compensation at all, but simply his final wages, delivered alongside a threat that every employee in the data center would lose their job if he refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement. He had stayed silent for years so that hundreds of people could keep their livelihoods. Elias Wren confirmed that the value of the preferred shares named in the covenant had grown substantially over 12 years, not because anyone had managed them wisely, but because the very system Nolan built had continued quietly protecting the company from failures no one else understood well enough to prevent. Vivian asked her father's former general counsel, present in the room as a silent witness, why the covenant had never been honored, and the man admitted under pressure that Evelyn had personally instructed him to file it away rather than register it formally. The admission drew a sharp intake of breath from several board members who realized, for the first time, how deliberately the truth had been buried rather than simply lost. Nolan listened to the exchange without visible reaction, though something in his posture eased slightly, the tension of 12 years finally loosening its grip in small, almost imperceptible degrees. He had not come to this building expecting vindication of any kind, only steady work and a paycheck that would let him keep his small promises to his daughter, and the sudden arrival of both truth and recognition left him more unsettled than triumphant. Della, watching quietly from near the door, allowed herself a small, private smile, having spent weeks wondering exactly what kind of man she had taken under her wing without ever suspecting the full shape of his story. Vivian realized her father had not only let Nolan take the blame, he had allowed the company to profit quietly from his sacrifice for over a decade. She apologized to him publicly in front of the entire board. Nolan did not forgive her immediately, telling her that an apology only carries weight once the people who benefited from the original lie accept the consequences that come with it. Evelyn, sensing the room turning against her, called for an emergency vote, attempting to remove Vivian from her position before the Reed covenant could be formally verified. Several board members she had quietly influenced over the years immediately sided with her. The vote began just as the building's electrical system started flashing warning signals across every monitor in the room. Nolan looked at the display and understood immediately that a transfer unit was about to overheat. If it failed, the entire data connection supporting the audit would be severed, giving Evelyn the opening to claim the evidence itself had been tampered with. Nolan stood, removed his custodial badge from around his neck, and spoke to the room in a voice that finally carried the full weight of what he once had been. Everyone in this room has 7 minutes before the building loses its entire backup power supply, he said. Evelyn accused him of manufacturing panic to delay the vote in Vivian's favor. Vivian believed him without hesitation, halting the meeting immediately and authorizing emergency technical access on the spot. Nolan did not act like some lone hero rushing to save the day. He assigned clear roles to the maintenance team, security staff, and Della, refusing to let any single person tamper with a dangerous system alone. He directed the technical crew to isolate the compromised switching station and reroute power through an older backup line, one he had personally designed more than a decade earlier and that had simply been forgotten rather than removed. That old line still existed only because no one at the company had ever fully understood it well enough to dismantle it. Evelyn attempted to leave the boardroom with her phone and a folder of documents, but Vivian ordered security to keep every board member inside until the evidence could be secured. Vivian stood near the boardroom window, watching the city lights blur slightly through the rain-streaked glass. Aware that the next several minutes would determine not only the fate of the merger, but the credibility of everything she had built since taking her father's chair. She thought briefly of the letter still resting on the table, its ink now feeling less like a confession and more like a set of instructions she was finally learning to follow. There was no shouting, no physical struggle, only the tense pressure of a countdown clock and the knowledge that critical proof could vanish within minutes. In the technical room, Nolan discovered that the failing equipment had been quietly programmed to erase its own logs the moment it lost power. He instructed Elias to back up the data to an independent server immediately, working against the same countdown that was ticking through every monitor in the building. With barely 2 minutes remaining on the countdown, one of the younger technicians hesitated at a junction box, uncertain which cable to disconnect first, and Nolan crossed the room without raising his voice, guiding the young man's hands with the patience of someone who had trained a dozen engineers before him. He explained each step as he went, not because there was time to spare for teaching, but because he refused to let panic replace precision even under pressure this severe. Della stood near the doorway relaying updates to Vivienne by radio, her voice steady despite the chaos, while Elias worked frantically to mirror the last of the vulnerable data onto a portable drive before the connection could be lost. Seconds before the primary station shut down completely, the backup line Nolan had built years earlier activated exactly as intended. The lights across the building flickered once, then steadied. Every contract, every email, and every unauthorized override command was preserved intact. The activity logs revealed that Evelyn's own executive account had approved the command that disabled the original warning system in the first place. When Nolan returned to the boardroom, not a single person in the room was laughing at his uniform anymore. Evelyn insisted he had simply gotten lucky. Vivian placed his old access badge beside the recovered Reed Covenant and addressed the room directly. "He just saved this company for the second time," she said, and she tried to sell it, after convincing everyone he was the one who destroyed it the first time. The board turned to Nolan and asked whether he intended to use his veto power to collapse the merger entirely. In the quiet hour after the vote concluded, Nolan sat alone for a moment in an empty conference room, turning the old access badge over in his hands and remembering the version of himself who once believed loyalty to a company would always be returned in kind. He thought of every night shift, every quiet insult absorbed without complaint, and every choice he had made to protect people who never knew his name. And he understood that none of it had been wasted, even during the years when it felt entirely pointless. Nolan had every opportunity to take his revenge, to block every pending decision, crash the stock, and force half the leadership out of their positions in a single motion. He chose not to, unwilling to let thousands of innocent employees suffer for one executive's greed. Instead, he used the authority granted by the Reed Covenant only to suspend the merger and demand a complete independent audit of the company's operations. He set 3 conditions before agreeing to any restructuring of his shares. Evelyn Harrington would step down from every executive position for the duration of the investigation. The company would publicly correct the employment records of Nolan and every other worker who had been wrongly blamed over the years. The company would also establish formal protections for whistleblowers and a fair standard of treatment for service and maintenance workers across every department. One director, visibly shaken by how close the company had come to losing its most sensitive records, asked Nolan why he had not simply demanded a seat on the board itself, given the leverage now sitting plainly in his hands. Nolan answered that authority earned through fear rarely outlasted the person who wielded it, and that he had no interest in becoming the very thing that had nearly destroyed him 12 years earlier. His response quieted the room in a way that no legal argument had managed to all afternoon, and even Vivian found herself studying him with a kind of respect she had not expected to feel for a man she had met only days before. The board accepted every condition without objection. Evelyn was escorted out by internal security, not through violence, but through the cold, quiet silence of people who had once feared her and no longer did. As she passed Nolan, she told him he was still just a man who had walked in here begging to mop floors. Nolan answered without any bitterness in his voice. "That is true," he said, "and that is exactly what let me see what the people on the top floor refuse to look at." Paige Calloway was suspended pending an investigation into her conduct. Nolan did not ask for her career to be destroyed, but he refused to speak in her defense either, letting the consequences of her choices fall where they belonged. Vivian offered him a newly created position, Director of Infrastructure and Operational Integrity, a role built specifically around what he had proven he could do. Nolan did not accept right away. He asked that Della Monroe be given a seat on the company's new Labor Reform Committee, believing she understood the people who moved invisibly through the building far better than any executive ever could. In the end, Nolan accepted the new role, but only after finishing the custodial shift he had already begun that evening. Vivian found him later wiping a coffee stain from the very lobby floor where he had once been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. She asked why he still bothered, now that it clearly was not required of him anymore. A job does not become beneath someone simply because powerful people refuse to do it themselves, he told her. Vivian bent down, picked up a cup someone had carelessly left behind, and placed it into the trash herself. It was a small gesture, but it was the first sign that she wanted to change the company itself, not merely repair its public image. The story closes several months later, back inside the same building where it began. A new nameplate now sits on the executive floor, reading Nolan Reed, Director of Infrastructure and Operational Integrity. Beneath the title, at his own request, one additional line was added. Everyone inside this building deserves to be heard. In the lobby, the custodial staff no longer use the side entrance reserved for service workers. And when Vivian watches Nolan walk through the front doors each morning, she sees a man who did not need to be rescued by anyone, only a man who had finally been given back the recognition that had always belonged to him. Harper Reed learned the full truth only much later. On the afternoon, her father was invited to speak at a small ceremony honoring the maintenance and custodial staff of Ashcroft Global for their contribution to the company's safety record. She sat in the front row beside Della, watching her father stand at a modest podium instead of a boardroom stage, and she understood for the first time why he had always come home, smelling faintly of cleaning solution and looking, despite everything, quietly proud. Nolan kept his remarks brief, telling the room that he had learned more about a company's true character from the people who cleaned its floors after midnight than from anyone who had ever occupied its top offices during the day. He thanked Della by name, along with several custodial workers the company had never once acknowledged publicly before that afternoon, insisting their names appear in the official program rather than his own photograph on the cover. Evelyn Harrington's name eventually surfaced in a separate regulatory inquiry unrelated to Ashcroft Global, one that quietly ended her influence across the broader financial circles she had once commanded with ease. Nolan felt no satisfaction when he heard the news, only a distant sense that the truth, however delayed, had finally caught up with the version of events she had spent so long trying to bury. Paige Calloway left the company within the year, though Nolan later heard she had taken a position at a smaller firm known for treating its employees fairly, a small detail he chose to view as evidence that people could still change course when given the chance. Vivian restructured the company's hiring practices so that no application could ever again be dismissed on the basis of a resume gap or a second-hand jacket, a policy she insisted on writing into the employee handbook herself. The building Nolan once entered as a stranger applying to mop its floors became, in time, a place that finally understood the difference between a person's title and a person's worth.